Congress had just signed the Declaration of Independence, which, folks, is the most prominence gets on the Declaration. But really, the signing was signed by a bunch of lawyers that signed a piece of paper that said, we shall declare these things. It was the fighting afterwards for 8 years that actually sealed the deal. And in that battle, it wasn't just the Declaration, because a month later, in August of 1776, right after they had signed it, the ink was not dry. The revolution that they had begun against British tyranny was on the verge of disastrous and sudden collapse. Just a month after they signed it, in August 1776, General George Washington found his troops outmanned. They were outmaneuvered and outbattled in the Battle of Brooklyn, and it looked like there was no escape. Folks, the British Army and Navy was the largest in the world at the time. They sent a third of their Army and Navy to the colonies to crush the rebellion, to literally obliterate it. Within 1 month after signing the Declaration of Independence, General George Washington and his troops, of which there was about 30,000, they were just about ready to be crushed. But there was a series of rearguard attacks that allowed the entire Continental Army to retreat from Brooklyn, and there was only 400 people, they call the Immortal 400, from Maryland's brigade that helped them secure their retreat. In other words, if these 400 from Maryland did not help, then the whole army would have been crushed and the whole revolution would have been over within a month. And it was about an hour of time that they had. You say, well, what did this Maryland group do? They charged the British with bayonets successively over and over again to buy time for the rest of Washington and General Sterling's troops to get out from Brooklyn and Manhattan and escape. That wasn't the only test, because shortly after that, they had to get over the Manhattan over the East River onto Manhattan. They had some 20,000 troops that had to cross the river, and they didn't know how they were going to get there because the British Navy had over 500 ships in the bay. Witnesses to the event said that they looked out onto the bay from New York and Manhattan and Long Island, and they said it looked like a forest with so many masts on those ships. There were so many of them. I mean, Britain was determined to crush this rebellion. How were they going to cross that East River and get onto Manhattan and get away? Well, that's where the Marbleheads came in. Right at the right time in the right place, the course of events changed by just a few people being heroic. On August 29th, the Continental Army faced capture. They were trapped, and they were forced against the East River, heading into Manhattan, the small island. The fate of the whole thing was rested on a few soldier mariners called the Marbleheads from Massachusetts. Marbleheads were people that just used their fishing boats, their trawlers, and everything else. Serving side by side in one of the country's first diverse units, they pulled off an American Dunkirk. In other words, they pulled all these troops across the river. It wasn't just one trip, it was dozens of trips they had to take. Folks, there are certain times in history where it's just a fraction of amount of time which steers the course of human events. Just a month after the Declaration of Independence was signed, we were nearly done with the revolution. But it took a few hours from a few people, just a spark, to keep it going. Today I want to talk about what it sounds like to actually have freedom. What's the sound of it? In Psalm 2, if you're there, why don't you read along with me in verse 1 through 3. It says, why do the nations rage? Why do they rage? Why do the people plot a vain thing? It says, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together. That's why they meet together in their nice groups. World Economic Forum, International Monetary Fund, Bilderberg groups. They counsel together. They counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. This is what they say. They say, let us break their bonds in pieces and let us cast away their cords from us. The Olive Branch Petition was adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 5th, 1775, a year before the Declaration was signed. A year before that, they sent an olive branch petition to the king, King George of Great Britain. King George refused it, rejected it, and said that he was going to squash the rebellion. The colonies had no choice but to say, listen, we either hang separately or we hang together. But all 13 colonies had to strike midnight at the same time. It all had to happen in unison. We couldn't be one or the other part. We all had to be in the same place. In order to make that decision, you have to say, well, what was in the hearts of these individuals? Because, folks, it was only maybe 25% of the colonies that were really, really wanting to go through with this resistance. You say there's 3/4 of the colonies were willing to just be under British rule. You say, really? I thought that the revolution was big. No, it really wasn't. It was a minority, but they were willing to make the decision. This minority was willing to sign their homes, their families, their fortunes, everything that they had accumulated in this earth in order for what they saw as their opportunity to go out from underneath the rule of a hand of a man, a tyrannical hand of a man ruling over them. It says, why did the nations rage, the psalmist says? Why does this happen? Sometimes it has to fall into the hearts of men in any generation. It has to say, you know what, I'm not going to live under the governorship of someone else's hand. I want to live underneath the hand of God. I want to be subservient to His will, because in His will I actually taste real freedom. But the nations rage against that, and they say, we don't want to live under the governorship of God. We want to cast away any type of cords or restraints that He has placed upon nature and upon us. In fact, we want to be our own gods. We want to decide what is good, and we want to decide what is evil. We want to create our own world, our own reality. And throughout history, fallen humanity has tried to cast out of its conscience the knowledge and testimony of the presence of God over and over and over. And I said the glimmer of hope today is that every nation that rises against God will fall. And every haughty spirit will see a point in which its destruction comes. It is inevitable. We see it in history time and time again, whether it was those that were heading into the Indus River Valley and the Indian nations rose and fall, or whether it was those that were spreading off into China, and China rose in the Ming Dynasty and fell, whether it was Greek and Mark Antony and the Greek Empire rose and fell, whether it was Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, it rose and fell. And you say, why do these nations rise up and then fall? Can't they just be sustained? Well, the most recent one we can think of is probably World War II. World War II was a major world war, but there was a third 1,000-year reign that someone was intending to actually establish in the earth. 1,000-year reign, 1,000-year Reich, of which it rises up, the nation rises up, and we see the end of that. It fell, didn't it? Rises and falls. There falls into the heart of individuals the same cry to say, Lord, I'm not going to submit myself underneath the hand of mankind who's determined to rebel against you, because in doing so, I subserve myself underneath their will. And they're determined to cast you out. Consider the book of Acts, when the first believers were coming underneath threats themselves. It says that the Israelites and the elders had conferred amongst themselves. They said to them, these disciples of Jesus, and they called it the way, preaching of the way into heaven, the way through to the Father was Jesus. These disciples of Jesus, for indeed that a notable miracle has been done, they said, through them. Everybody in Jerusalem is evident of it. We cannot deny what's happened. But so that it spreads no further than among these people, let us severely threaten the disciples. From now on, they can speak to no man, no woman in the name of Jesus. So they called them and they commanded them not to speak at all or teach at all in the name of Jesus or under the authority of Jesus or being submitted to Jesus as Lord. But Peter and John answered this group of leaders. They said, whether it's right in the sight of God who's watching us to listen to you more than try to listen to him, you be the judge of what we should do. For we cannot but speak the things of which we seen and we heard. So when they had further threatened them, they said they let them go, finding no way of punishing them underneath the law, because the people, since they all glorified God, had seen what had happened. The threats the disciples received were nothing new. Folks, I call any type of pressure against doing what you know is the right thing to do, to speak out or to be a testimony to God. Anytime there's pre-threatens, there's pre-pressure for that, I call that a pre-awakening. A pre-awakening because the threats of darkness always come just before the light breaks out. Whenever God does something profound, his people will inevitably face opposition. Think of it this way from 1 Peter. 1 Peter says it this way when he wrote this letter. He said to the church, "Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you." Don't think it's strange, as though some strange thing is happening to you, but instead rejoice. Rejoice inasmuch as you're partakers of Christ's suffering, for he faced opposition and pressure as well, that when his glory shall be revealed, you will be glad and in exceeding joy. In other words, when Jesus comes, guess who's the first people that are going to rejoice when he comes? It'll be the believers that stood against those that threatened not to talk about him. We would say, hallelujah, he's real, he's alive. Hallelujah, I believed in him, and I suffered not my life even unto death. They're going to rejoice in that day. Peter was saying to the people at the time, he was saying this, don't think it's strange when we have to fight opposition just to reclaim some sense of godliness. Don't think it strange. Same way you and I, our hearts desires believers is others to come to believe in Jesus too. I was looking this week for signs, things to put on our sign. It'd been blank for several weeks, and I was like, I need something good to put on my sign. But every time I looked it up, I found the most corny sayings. I said, I can't put that on the sign. I don't want to put that on there. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to think of one. Lord, give me one to think of. And so the one out there is the one that he gave me. Belief in Jesus gives the heart hope. Belief in Jesus gives the heart hope. What does that mean? Everyone who believes wants other people to know Jesus as we do. There's not an insincere heart in this place that says, I want everybody. Paul himself was standing before the king and before the procurator of Rome itself and said, I would rather have you be in chains and know Jesus than to be a king and not to know him. He said, I'd rather have you be in my condition, but know Jesus. I want you to be born again in him, anew. And I think in our hearts, that's the same cry. We want our cities, our people to feel the same hope we have because we put our belief in Jesus. In darkness, there's one thing about darkness is it doesn't have a name. It's not personalized. It's not a person. It's not a fellow human being. The book of Ephesus tells us that. Paul said we don't war against flesh and blood. So really our fight isn't to slug it out amongst each other. Well, Lord knows we don't need more missiles and bombs dropping around this place. Really, we don't need more. No, we don't need more. That's not the fight. Darkness doesn't have a personalized name. Darkness exerts its power this way. Darkness exerts its power in the minds of mankind. Romans tells us that their minds were darkened, it says. In Corinthians, it says to lift the veil off of their eyes, for they have been darkened in their consciousness, their awareness, their conscious means with knowledge. Their knowledge of God has been clouded. It has been darkened. He says, so it's not a person. It exerts its pressure on the thoughts. It transmits through the words that are used by those that live within it. That's why we confuse it, because somebody who's living in darkness is going to speak from the aspect of being influenced by it. The fruits of their lives is the action taken. Based on what? Based on what they believe. It's like the atheist and the one that believes in creation. And you say, the atheist himself needs Jesus just as much as you and I do. But his explanation of the world has been darkened, so the words come from the influence they have from it. John's gospel says it this way. And we all know the 16th verse of chapter 3. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, right? That whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Verse 17, and I love this, it says, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Remember, the born-again experience is the experience of being quickened in the Spirit to know who Jesus is. The salvation happens when judgment comes. And you're not underneath the judgment of God. You're not underneath the condemnation of evil or wickedness. You have been saved from that. So he said those that believe in him might be saved. But it goes on to say this, and this is the point which I made with this light and darkness. He who believes in Jesus, who put their belief in, is not condemned. But he who does not believe is already underneath that condemnation. In other words, it's happening on an inevitable road. It's going to occur. Those that are in darkness, darkness will be swallowed up with condemnation. It goes on to say this. It says, and this is the condemnation that comes, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone who practices evil hates the light and doesn't come into it, lest their deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes into the light, that the deeds might be clearly seen. In other words, it's not the person, it's where they're residing. It's not a person that is an influence upon them. That's why we say in James, it says sometimes we got to snatch people out of that place. Sometimes we've got to call unto them. We got to shine the light into it because the influence is great. Because we want everyone who's underneath the influence of darkness needs to come into the light so that they can see more clearly. So in order to get this idea, the darkness will always be opposed to light. In fact, in the book of Exodus, we see a great picture of this. This is a good example of opposition just before light comes. It says, there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more mightier than we have. Let us deal with them shrewdly. Let's deal with them and press them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event that we're at war with someone, they join our enemies and overthrow us. So then the Pharaoh set taskmasters over them to afflict them and threaten them and give them burdens. And they built for Pharaoh his supply cities. He says it this way, we will tell you what you can build, what you must build according to our specs. You can go to your house of worship, but you must worship our way. You must bend your knee to our will. And if you refuse, it's going to cost you. That's a translation for the 21st century. You can speak of Jesus, but don't say he's the only way. There are some people that may believe there's other ways. You can speak about the gospel, but you've got to make sure that it doesn't exclude, it doesn't divide, it doesn't make us choose, it doesn't challenge. Make sure it's acceptable. Do you hear what I'm saying here? Pharaoh said, you're going to build this my way, this way. You can go to your houses of worship, you can do that, but you're going to end up bending the knee to me, Pharaoh said. He's going to bring in a sense of opposition. Now, between you and me, I can just tell you, Pharaoh was walking deep in darkness because the influence upon his life was darkness. And what he did was exerted the darkness over the people who were going to bring the light, the truth of who the true God was, and his plan for the world. It was through the Israelites, and he was exerting that darkness. It's interesting today that we can feel the exertion of darkness in our life, but sometimes we're kind of complexed as to how we react to it. We can say, you know what, there are freedoms we've known, but some of those are in jeopardy, folks. There's opposition that we face sometimes. Sometimes we can actually feel like you could be pushed out or threatened or jeopardized. I remember the day I was brought into the vice president's office in my workplace, and I was said, you know, you can talk, but don't talk about Jesus like that. You know. Or what? Right? There's the question. Or what? Will I lose my job? I don't want to jeopardize my job, my family. You might be the only voice of a minority. Folks, when they signed the Declaration of Independence, it was just a minority. And they were standing up against, at the time, the world's superpower. The British monarch was absolutely, it kept colonies everywhere. The king could rule. They said to the king, most sovereign, most majestic majesty. They exalted this man upon the earth and said, we are colonies, subservient, subjects is the word. Subjects. You know what another subject is, right? Cattle is a subject. A bale of hay is a subject. A bale of cotton is a subject. So are his people. This is a man who has a crown, who's exalted himself as though he's above the hand of God. And these few said, you know, I'd rather live in freedom. Well, what was his response? Threats. You will not. Today, I think we're kind of getting close to another place where we say, well, we're not going to have a physical revolution here. There's something else going on, and it's in the minds of men and women. It's in the minds of children. It's the influence of darkness that comes into the minds of people so that they believe one thing and not the other, and they get caught up in darkness. And when we come in with a light, it's going to start pressing against that. It's interesting because we see this as King Nebuchadnezzar had exalted himself to this throne of his own self-glory. And he said, I'm going to build a statue to myself. It'll look like me, but be pure gold. And then I'll have everybody assemble around it, face it. And then I'll command them, all the nations and languages, at the time that you hear a sound of a horn, when you hear the flute and the harp and the lyre, and you hear the singers and the symphony, all kinds of music, then when you see this, you shall fall down and worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar, this giant statue. Whoever does not fall down, now listen, there's always opposition. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the fiery furnace. What a threat. The olive branch petition was set a year before the Declaration of Independence. The olive branch petition was the colony saying, listen, we recognize you as king, you've established a throne, but we fought the French-Indian War with you. But ever since that war has been done and we helped you, you have been so harsh on us. Your leaders are corrupt. Your governors you send over, they're like little fiefdoms. Your troops come into our house, they stomp and steal our goods, they set fire. There's a whole litany of things on the Declaration of Independence. It's not just the one paragraph. They listed 2 pages of things that happened. Your courts are corrupt. You tell us that you've already had the court. It already gave me charges and I'm already guilty. They were listening to these things. All they said was, listen, lighten it up a little bit, King George. That was the petition. Lighten it up. We've helped you. We've become prosperous. We want to see you succeed. What is George's response? If you want to go that route, you can go into the fiery furnace. If you want to go that route, then we're going to deal with you severely, as Peter and the disciples. You're not to name these. And all they said, we want to live underneath God, God alone. However, we see what? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's friends. What did they do when the music started? What did they do when they recognized the opposition was? They knew it was coming ahead of time. The decree was written. What did they do at the moment they had to do it? They refused to bow. They refused to say, no, I refuse to bow. They asked him this. King Nebuchadnezzar declared it. He says, why don't you bow? He said to these 3. The 3 of them answered the king himself. We have no need to answer you concerning the matter. If it's the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from your furnace, then he'll deliver us. But if not, then let it be known, king, that we don't serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image. We won't corrupt what we believe, in whom we believe, just because you told us there's a threat, just because there's opposition. I try to tell this to so many people. Isaiah says it so straight. He says, we like sheep have all gone astray, each to our own way. Not just one way. Just because I see somebody, and you name it, I see somebody that's actually like killing themselves, drinking from the bottle. Or maybe they're sleeping on the streets because of a needle. Or maybe they're in a relationship that's going to damage their relationship with God because God hasn't sanctioned that relationship. It doesn't mean, it's all a different way, but we've all gone our own way, he said. He said all in a different way. So I never look at 1 or 2. I'm just saying, hey, that's going to lead you away from God. You're going to go astray from him. And he's calling you back. And so you're the one out of the 99. And that's not you're unacceptable. You're not intolerant. I said, there's nothing to do. My love for you is the same. I just don't want you to see us stumbling in the darkness. Well, that offends me that I'm in the dark, but I've been enlightened. I've gone to 4 years of school. I got 2 degrees. Good for you. It still doesn't mean that darkness hasn't influenced the mind because of what you believe. And it's not the person, folks. It's the darkness that influences the mind. You understand? It's not the person. That's why everyone wants to make it about a fight. It's not about a fight. It's about the darkness that's influencing the person. Our part is to say to ourselves, we refuse to bow. In other words, if it exalts itself above the knowledge of God, then it's a stronghold that must be taken down. we're simply going to serve God, whether there's a fiery furnace as a result or not. My question is this: are you willing to do the same? I mean, really, folks, what does the sound of freedom sound like, actually? What does it sound like, It can be summed up this way: the American experience is so unique, it's never been tried the way it was tried here. But you know very well over time that darkness was going to encroach, and you knew that, right? It was shortly after the Continental Congress had established the Constitution, the Articles of Incorporation said this is how we're going to run our governing structure. It was shortly after they agreed to those they came out. And history tells us there was a crowd outside of Philadelphia where they signed it. And they said to one of those leaders that signed it, they says, well, what kind of government do we have? What kind, right? Do we have a monarchy? What do we have? They said, you have a republic with representation. If you can keep it. If you can keep it. I mean, it was fragile enough that it actually could have darkness encroach upon it. Absolutely, folks. We knew sooner or later it was, right, folks? I mean, basically it said the only way this thing works is if people within positions of leadership are righteous. That's the only way it works. The unrighteous in those seats can abuse it and its people very easily, very quickly. And yet now today we say, wow, look, how do we stand? We stand and say, listen, we exalt God above all. We serve Him and Him only do we serve. Am I willing to do the same when darkness crouches? It'll require people who bend to the will of the Lord and not the will of man, I'll tell you that. It's only the arrogance of humanity. It's only arrogance in the humanity that we can take something that we know is wrong and make it right. We can redefine things. You realize what they did in other countries when they destroyed its structures of governance, right? They took out all of the statues. They removed all of the history from the books. I mean, we're watching that. It's like, wait a minute. And you say, well, it's the people. No, I'm not going to start punching faces, folks. That's not the point. The point is darkness is encroaching, and it'll influence the minds. And when it influences the minds, guess what happens? Darkness comes over, and then things are removed. You think the same thing happened when the Bolsheviks overturned the czars in Russia? They did the same things. They wiped out the whole middle class. They put to death anybody that had any knowledge or any wisdom at all. They removed it all. What about the Mao Zedong and the Red Revolution? Did the same thing. They disarmed the people. They took the middle class. They killed all the people that were professors or teachers. Why? So that they had the poor and the young. And when they could influence the young's minds, they grew them up to think differently. And when they thought differently, darkness fell upon the country, not in the form of a person, but in the form of its ideas and influences. And pretty soon the nation was under lock. It was easier to control. This was the only experiment where it was just like, listen, you've got your freedom if you're willing to stand up for it. We say, how do I stand up for it? I refuse to be influenced by what I know to be darkness because I don't want to stumble in that anymore. How many in this room remember being in darkness, stumbling around? How many remember fell and skinned their knee because of the things they would do and say, why do I keep tripping like that? And Jesus said, you have the light, walk in the light so you don't stumble in it. When you have the light, you can see better. You gotta watch that one, and you jump over this danger, and you can see better. And it's an individual life. How much do I let encroach? How much do I let come into the minds of what I believe? Now, some of you probably are saying, wow, if you can see it, you can see it. Get into the books, get into the media, get into the young, raise them up and let them believe something else before long. And have them fight against it physically. No, we don't need to fight. We don't need to be throwing stones at each other. What we need to be doing is just simply saying, I'm going to refuse to bow to that belief and ideology. I will believe. Joshua said it this way, listen, I'm on my way out. You guys are going to have to rule underneath the hand of God. Remember the period of the judges. What was his last command? He said, serve the Lord and Him only. For as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It was his last parting shot over a people that were going to go into it and say, hey, it's fragile. It's fragile if you can keep it. Now we saw what happened with that. We saw the people stray away, walk in darkness, come underneath the influence of it. get chastised, God would raise up a Savior. We remember that back and forth. I say the church right now should be at the point where we say, well, Lord, we're not going to actually, we want to change in the mind. What happens when the minds change? What happens? You know what happens. The way you think about life changes. What you think about changes. How you deal with people changes. It kind of makes me want to start a new revolution. But not one with muskets. I don't need muskets. You defend your home and your life. God says He gave it to you. But I'm saying I'm not starting a revolution with muskets. I want to make a declaration of independence for our kids. I want a new revolution. The signers of the Declaration of Independence knew very well that they were giving up their homes, everything. And some did. A lot of them lost their property. They lost their homes. They lost it all. What? For their kids to grow up knowing they didn't have to serve a man's hand saying, you shall bring your cotton to me. You shall buy this. You shall... No fort, no Pharaoh. Please. We want righteous leaders. It says when righteous leads, people are happy. When the unrighteous lead, they're not. They're miserable. I want a revolution, but what does that start with? Lamentations tells us, arise and cry out in the night, it says. Arise, stand up and do this. At the beginning of the watch, pour out your heart, it says. It says, cry and pour out your heart like water before the face of the Lord. Then it says, lift up your hands. Cry out, pour out your heart, lift up your hands toward Him, the life of your young children, who faint from hunger at the head of every street. I was watching, France is exploding. And you know who's on the street breaking the windows and stuff? You know who's on the streets breaking and setting fire to things? The young. The young. Who was tromping around our cities the last 2 years? Remember all those riots came through and they picked out some issue? Listen, the Watts riots that happened in LA started the same way. It started on some premise. It was just someone that got pulled over for something, but no one got hurt. But next thing you know, everybody was telling everybody, hey, this is happening. And then the next thing you know, you got riots. They're burning. I said, this is the young. So how do we change that? We said, whoa, we got to have a revolution of their mind. We have to have a light that shines in. It says, hey, listen, we believe this, we believe that. Sooner or later, they're going to have to make a choice. Unless the believer says, whatever choice you want to make is fine with me. No, you got to give them one. And you got to share it in a way that they see that there's light within it. Lamentation says the first cry out, pour your heart out, lift up your hands for them. I know the signers of the Declaration of Independence weren't necessarily thinking of their lives. They were thinking about the lives to come. And I got a video that I want us to play here. Do you have that, Richie, ready, set up? Because I also want to let everybody know about this, but I'm going to play this and I'm going to wrap this up. So stick with me just a few more minutes. I'm going to wrap this up. That video, that Sound of Freedom video, Angel Studios is coming out with a movie. It starts on the 4th called Sound of Freedom. And I wanted to watch the trailer for it. So, Jeffrey, could you hit the lights? And then you'll have to bring adjust the volume as you need it there, okay? Volume. Might be the doubles. Keep going, the double slide. Yeah, in the middle. Go on. One more. That's good. Thanks, guys. Tim Ballard was a federal agent for years, 12 years. Um, and he hit a roadblock. He was trying to fight human trafficking and child human trafficking, and he hit a roadblock, and he had to quit his job and continue the work that he was called by God to do. And the movie is based kind of on Tim Ballard's life. And one particular thing that moved him was a boutique hotel that was being used in the world to traffic children. A boutique hotel was hidden, and they hardly found it. They found 400 kids there, and it wasn't even finished yet. There could have been thousands more. They rescued them. And folks, when I hear numbers like 83,000 kids have come into this country and they don't know where they are, we don't know where they went, and it just kind of passes over like it's a blip in the news. And I'm like, wait, time out. We know that there's been several million people that have come into the country, but listen, put that apart. How many kids have come into this country and you don't know where they are? You don't know where they went. You don't know who they're with. 83,000? And then we wonder things like this. Now listen, darkness is trying to encroach on it. Why? To be a place where darkness can rule, where the influence over people's minds can rule. And it's happening close to us, around us. And so as believers, we have to say, wait a minute, what should we do about this? And I know exactly what we do. We do what Lamentations said. That's what we do. In fact, until you hear the sound of freedom from someone that's being made free, I think the sound of freedom begins by God hearing us cry out. I think that's the sound of freedom, is because we have ours and now we're imploring Him to save others. I think that's the sound. It's the sound of others that are praying in intercession for other people. I think it begins there. That's the sound of freedom. For we live in a country that's made it possible, and He's merciful and He's patient. He loves us and He'll answer us when we cry to Him. And so I'd like to do something different this year. This has moved to me, and I'm telling you, this week has been pressure on me. Like, I've had dream after dream after dream about this, and they're threatening dreams, and I'm like, I'm going to say this regardless. We're going to do this regardless. The video stream went down just before I started talking. It's got a black screen now, and I said, just forget about it. I said, don't worry about it. Never happened before, but it's not streaming now. And I'm like, you know what? We need to go straight to the heavenlies, and we need to pray. So I've selected a song that we'll close with, and I want to open up, and the song will be kind of our prayer time. But the song is about speaking blessings to this generation. Folks, we need to start right now praying for the next generation, the young. Right now, so that light can come into their lives as they grow older. And we got to, and I'll tell you, within the next months or so, again, I'm super excited because God is going to equip us. We're going to go get them. We're going to go pick them up. Let's do it. We come into the fall, or we come into the end of the year, and we're going to get a strategy going where we can go get them and pick them up and give them the light of the gospel and get it into the young right now so that they can grow up knowing the gospel. Richie, do you have that song ready to go to from YouTube? Let the song kind of start, but let's get an attitude. We're going to close the service this morning by praying. So whatever you feel comfortable doing, sit in your seat. If you want to come to the altar, you can come to the altar. But I want to pray for them as well as the Spirit leads us. Because I think God honors it when we protect the children. You say, well, I raised my children up. And listen, folks, all you have to do is raise them up in the way they should go. And when they grow older, it doesn't say exactly what age. It says when they grow older, they won't depart from that. In other words, they will revert to that line that you gave them to revert because you started it off. And you know as well as I do, once you lay the tracks down right, you know where they lead to, right? Now, they might walk off the track, and they might have some broken glass to walk back over to get back, but they know where the track is. And they know where the train's going, and they'll get back to that track. Sooner or eventually, the darkness gets cold, folks, and there is no light or warmth in it, and you come back to the fire and you come back to the light. I'm telling you, if you did it when they're young. So let's go ahead and play that song. Let's carry Job's song. And then I'm going to adjust that a little bit so the song. Yeah. Come on, let's get in that prayer. You need to stand up, step aside. Let's let heaven hear us today.
Yeah.